start of the lecture. So, I sound quite young, but anyone who is young has the access to get an infinite amount of information through the internet. And that's what I did. I decided I was going to do a summary of every single mission in the Apollo program. And so I wrote down Apollo 1 in my Google Docs file and said, okay, Apollo 1 is the first mission, right? Wrong. Apparently, there's way more. And a lot of people don't actually know that the Apollo was never by itself. It was Mercury and Gemini, in which I'm going to mention them briefly. Mercury was simply just the initially pushing NASA into space. They initially figured out how rockets work and how to put a man in space safely. Gemini was a study of Earth's orbit. Basically, in Gemini, they figured out, okay, if we go here and here at this and this time, we can reach the moon. Uh, Midway through both, well, Mercury was ending, and Gemini was beginning, or more like in the middle. That's when Apollo started. Apollo started with many test missions on with the Saturn series, and it all started with the Saturn 1, which moved to the Saturn IB, which was the rocket that carried the that was supposed to carry the Apollo 1 crew, that carried the Apollo 7 crew and the Apollo 9 crew. Through and most people know that there were 7 moon missions and 6 of them landed, as Apollo 13 never landed due to the Apollo 13 incident. But if you look at the little picture that Quarantine and Chill put up in the announcement, you can see Apollo 8 and 10. And I'm pretty sure a few people might be confused. I'm just like, wait, did they go to the moon? They did. However, they were only orbital missions. They reached the moon successfully, which was a huge triumph of success. All they needed was to use the LM, or lunar module, to land. But throughout Apollo 8, they did not have the lunar module, and on Apollo 10, they did have the lunar module, but it was only half filled. As fun fact, there's this little kind of myth. It's not exactly a myth, but NASA put only half of the fuel in the lunar module because if it was completely fueled, then they could, just land, and they would most likely gladly take that chance. So they only half fueled it. And Apollo 8 and 10 were simply orbital missions testing its gravity and testing a few things for Apollo 11. Now, at the start of this lecture, I mentioned that there were a lot of test missions. And when I say Apollo program, does Apollo 1, Apollo 11, and Apollo 13 come to your mind? I'm pretty sure that these are the most known Apollo missions, and most of the other Apollo missions are overlooked and not exactly mentioned that much. And because they're not that mentioned, it's really just what ends up happening is you never know the true magnitude of how much money, dedication, and knowledge was put into the Apollo program. And throughout the Apollo program, there were many scientists and people coming together to work on something great. It was almost like the Manhattan Project, but on space. And if the Apollo program never happened, we would never have gotten to space and never gotten through LEO or LEO, which stands for low Earth orbit. This is where the ISS and several satellites sit at. Apollo 17 was the final time that we've ever gone through LEO. Currently, at this point, we only stay in LEO. And many people believe that we never went to the moon. But really, there's so much proof and there's so much evidence that it just seems stupid how you could not know that they had went to the moon. Because if you look at all the pictures and everything, it seems like it had to have happened. led to. But then once again, those are just conspiracy theories, and who really believes those? Anyway, when the Apollo project started, a small council recommended to NASA to use the Saturn series, as it was a new coming series made by Werner von Braun, also the same man who created the V2 rocket during World War II. The V2 rocket was the very first rocket to ever get into space, and I'm pretty sure that the quarantined life, if I see it correctly, it's in its banner is JFK. In JFK, 1961, in Congress, he proposed that they were to go to the moon. However, this was not the famous moon speech. The moon speech was presented in 1962 at Rice University. And the moon speech said that it set a difficult goal for the Soviets and the Americans. The Soviets were already ahead in space, but the Americans had to set some sort of a goal that was good enough and hard enough that neither of them could pull it off easily, and both of them would need lots and lots of dedication to do this. The Soviets weren't had a lot of problems during their development of their N-1 rocket. This was also the Saturn V counterpart. Not only were many of the best scientists dying, but they weren't really dedicated to going to the moon. Really, they believed that the Americans just set a goal randomly and the Soviets had never truly agreed to it. And the the Apollo program, it seems like there was an unnecessary amount of money put into it, but they really took into consideration of the price. They they wanted to go to the moon, not just once because they realized people are first of all not going to believe it. Second of all, they're not going to gain as much research as they could. And third of all, we to this day, without the Apollo project and without Apollo 15 and some other missions, we could have never known that, or we could have never made the theory that a large rock hit Earth and got pulled into its orbit. Here's a little fun fact. Apollo 15 did two pretty cool things. One of the astronauts, his name was Alan L. Bean. This means Mr. Bean went to the moon. And so another cool thing is that the Apollo 15 astronauts, they brought up postal stickers. And this was named the Apollo 15 Postal Incident. These were illegal postal stickers, first of all. They were not verified by the postal system. And they brought it up there so they could later sell it for extra money. And if you look at the salary of an astronaut, it's actually quite low. But really, you could debate about this like all day. Should their salary be bigger? In which it really shouldn't. The astronauts, they have to go through an expensive, rigorous training process. They have to use expensive equipment. They have to go through incredibly expensive rockets to get to the ISS. And they're going to space. I mean, what else do you want? Going to space is one of the best things that a person can achieve in their life. You get to see the incredible view that very limited people get to see. And that's why space tourism is so popular at this point. But we're getting off track and we're going off of our original what's it called? Original lecture content, which was the Apollo program. And because the Apollo program was so well known, it gained a lot of people. The Apollo program in general, it was huge and it was amazing. It achieved something amazing. And many people might not believe this, but first of all, there were not 17 missions. There was no Apollo 2, 3, 5, or 6, Wait, no, there was 5 or 6. There was no 2, 3. So there were not 17 missions, however, 15 missions. And and 15 of those missions were the ones with the special names. All the other missions were the test missions, simple testing missions of the Saturn V, the Saturn IB, and the Saturn 1. I've already mentioned this, but for those who weren't there, um, this it had 28 missions, not 15, but 28. And because it had 28, its costs went through the roof. There were actually supposed to be 3 more missions, and NASA was planning to try to get an increase on their budget and go even further than Apollo 20. But budget cuts were made, and and it didn't happen. And now we're only left with 7 moon missions and one of them failing. Also, during Apollo 13, um, something interesting is when they landed, ships from all over the world, even the Soviets, had brought in ships to try to help with their recovery because they were so it was a miracle how they even came back. First of all, their fuel cells broke. Their fuel cells consisted of hydrogen, which would be combined with oxygen to not only create power, but as a byproduct create water. Those were broken. Both of their main oxygen tanks, which would fuel those fuel cells, were also broken. So even if their fuel cells were working, they still couldn't. So they now had to somehow figure out how to ration their air, ration their water, and figure out how to even live through the cold because they had an extreme low amount of power. They had nearly nothing. They had nothing to go off of. They had around 12 watts, which you kind of need 60 watts to run a vacuum cleaner for a few seconds. You can imagine how little power they had. And so they had to sleep in the cold and they had to deal with having no power, which meant that they could not use calculators, they could not use certain tools, but they had to use the stars to help them. And without the stars, they would have been lost in space, most likely for a very long time. But they had the lunar module, and you could say, oh, they could just take power from the lunar module. The docking system doesn't exactly work that way. The docking system is only meant to establish a full-on seal, so they can pass through without not going through vacuum. And if they went through vacuum, they would have no air, and they would most likely die, and it would be a safety hazard. And another cool thing, they had oxygen. They figured out that, oh, okay, we can take some extra oxygen from this tank and use it to breathe. But another problem is that they had oxygen, just no carbon dioxide. They had no way to get rid of carbon dioxide. And the filters, they had the filters all right, but because the command module had no power and they had no way to give it power, they had to use those filters in the lunar module. But the uh, the holes that they could put the filter in were much too large. And so they had to figure out how to use duct tape and whatever scratch they could find upon the ship to help them. So you really can see just how bad Apollo 13 was. And on Apollo 11, they hadn't actually done much. They more or less walked around the moon, received the initial moon samples, and didn't do much after that. Their EVA and ALSEP, or Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, was way smaller than other missions. And another interesting thing is that during the Apollo missions, they had mission classing. So they had, like, I'm pretty sure it was A to J. So the last three missions, Apollo 15, 16, 17, were J missions. J missions were precision of landing, and ALSLEP was much larger, as well as using the LRV, or Lunar Roving Vehicle. However, Apollo 11 was its own mission class. I believe it was H, I believe so, which was the initial lunar landing, which didn't have much to it, as I said before. Apollo 13, 14 were the were what's it called? I missions, which were simply precision landing and a small bit extra science, which was which 15, 16, 17 carried as much possible experiments as they possibly could. They pushed the weight to the limit, and they pushed um, the way to package the lunar roving vehicle to the limit, so they could put it into much as small of a space as possible, so they could just fit as many experiments as they could. Because around Apollo 14, they realized that the government's going to take away some of their funding. Because first of all, JFK's dream has now been filled on Apollo 11, and really, the government had and Congress had believed that they had collected enough science, so they cut their funding, and they had to be left at Apollo 17. A little cool fact here is that on Apollo 17, a man he was given the opportunity to go to the moon, and just last minute he was replaced with a geologist. That's a little sad because, like, really, it's kind of like if someone tells you you're gonna go to the moon, and then right before you're launched, they say, "Oh no, we have to replace you with a geologist that doesn't even have a PhD but a master's degree." It's not the greatest. It's not the greatest thing, and he may have actually been depressed after it. Actually, there's nothing telling me. There's nothing really telling that, and there's no real proof. But many people are believe that this may have happened, and there's really just so much. But I didn't exactly want to stretch this too long. I want to stretch it to about maybe 20 minutes, because it's all I have to say. Because really, if you think about it, and you take a little, and you take maybe like, and you take a nice part of your life to look for the knowledge that you want, and you take that knowledge and you put it into something else, you learn much more than you could just from reading it. If you take that knowledge that you read and you want to remember it, make something out of it. Make something good out of it. Don't simply make, I don't know, of 2 pages, oh, the Apollo program was this and this. Take your time and create something big. If you want to truly know that knowledge, and you want to be able to show people that you know that knowledge. And with that power, you can prove to anyone that you are someone who is smart. You are someone who took their time of their life to work on something big, to work on something great, something that proves knowledge. And if you can do that, well, you have achieved smartness. You have achieved the being able to show that you're smart. And I feel like I just repeated the same thing over and over, but they're a little bit different.